Hi everyone, in this tutorial I'm going to show you how to draw a spaniel in pastels, and this is going to focus on how to draw black fur. But before I jump into that, the first thing I like to do is get to work on the eye. Now I like to work in small sections, so once I've got the eye drawn in, that's when I start to work on the fur around it. Now my main priority here, as you can see, is I'm building up my lights and my darks. I'm paying very close attention to the contrast. And the first thing I did here is use a white pencil to map in that brightest highlight in the top of the eye. I therefore know that that's as bright as I can possibly get it, and if I do need to darken that up later, I can just add darker pastel on top. But for bright highlights, wherever it may be, the nose, the eyes, I always like to put a white layer in first, just so that I know I've got really good contrast. Now good contrast, good values is something I'm going to be talking about a lot in this video because that is relevant no matter what drawing we're working on, but black fur especially. Now the one thing that you can see here is look how many pencils for the different values that I'm using. Now when I talk about values, it's how light or how dark that pencil is. So one thing I'm not using here is just straight black. When drawing black fur, there are so many different tonal values here, many greys, blues, and sometimes the purples also have to be used to build up the depth within that fur. Now black fur is very reflective, so if it's a particularly bright day, you're going to have more blues. If it's a little bit more overcast, a bit more warmer maybe, there may even be some browner tones there. So this is all something to pay very close attention to. Now for this drawing I did use quite a few of my sky blue colours to bring a little bit more depth to those highlights. Now the one thing that I'm also focusing on, as well as my contrast, is the fur direction. Now the fur direction is not random, it follows the underlying bone and muscular structure. So if I don't get that accurate to that reference photo, it is going to then change the shape of the face, and therefore ultimately this portrait when finished will not resemble that animal in the way that it should. So I pay very, very close attention to that throughout the process. Now I decided to use my pastel pencils for the entire portrait here. You could of course use your pan pastels or soft pastel sticks for your base layer. Now if you do use those two methods, then you want to be very careful not to fill the tooth of the paper early on, because what that will do is it will prevent your pencils from being able to apply those details on top. You'll know if you feel the tooth of the paper because it almost feels like the surface is shiny and slippery. The pencil just won't be able to grip to that surface. So the only reason I'm using my pastel pencils here is because I like to just have a variety of methods. There are many tutorials on my Patreon channel where I'm using pan pastels and then the pencils on their own, just so then you've got a wide variety of techniques to use. Now the pencils and the way that I'm using these here, as I've said already, I'm focusing on the fur direction, but the fur length and fur thickness are also important. So how sharp your lead is, how much pressure you're applying to the pencil, how you're moving that pencil are all going to determine how those pencil strokes are created. Now the length of those pencil strokes is going to be determined by how long that fur should be in that area. So here, for example, I'm building up my lighter layers, really reinforcing those highlights, but I'm always moving that pencil in the way of the fur direction and the length of that fur. As we come down to the bridge of the nose next to the eye, that fur is significantly shorter, so my pencil strokes were only maybe in contact with that paper for a split second. Now I'm going to be using much longer pencil strokes when I start working on the ears. So all of these things, those three main things, you've got your layers, contrast and pencil technique, are all very, very important even at this base layer stage. Now although with pastels it's a very forgiving medium, so we can easily adjust things if we make a layer that we don't like, but I like to follow the fur direction early on, and you can see that I'm mapping in my main lights and darks. Now the reason I do this, especially when drawing spaniel ears, is because there is a lot of shapes here. The way that the fur is longer, it overlaps in many different ways. That can become quite confusing. So I want to try and simplify the process as much as I can. Now I do have a tutorial on Patreon, and it's a focus study of a spaniel ear, and you get the reference photo, liner and material list, and you can see all of that process where I'm really explaining thoroughly, step by step, how to create that realistic fur texture. But as you can see, it's all about the shapes. I'm not creating straight lines. Every single one of my pencil strokes is curved, and I'm focusing on my lights and my darks. When I'm drawing this, I'm not necessarily thinking, oh, I'm drawing a spaniel ear. It's purely just the shapes, values, lights and darks. Now the one thing is you've got to be fairly brave when drawing black fur. You can see there that I've gone down with a really dark black layer first, and I'm building up some of my highlights on top. Now I don't do this for every situation when drawing black fur, it is going to vary depending on the reference photo, but there was a very strong shadow in between the cheek and the ear that I wanted to make sure that I got that really, really dark. This is going to help to build up that three-dimensional look of the face, and that is all because I'm focusing on my contrast. The very last few details here where I'm adding those highlights, they do get left until the last layer because this is the fur now that's sitting on the very top. So it's always worthwhile when you're drawing any kind of fur to focus on what's next on top of the skin first and build up from there. Now I was really happy with the fur that I'd created so far. I focused on those three main things, the pencil, fur direction, fur length and fur thickness, and now I'm going to work on the other eye. This process is exactly the same with how I'm mapping in my lights and my darks, and you do want to be making sure that you're softening the edges of the eye and getting in those shadows. Now what this will do is help to build up that sphere shape, and it won't make that eye look two-dimensional. So if you don't focus on adding a shadow, for instance, at the top of the eye where you've got that dark eyelid, the eye is going to look like it comes to a real sudden stop. So by having that very subtle grey shadow in this situation, that's helped to make that eye look like it's just starting to roll back and create that sphere shape. Now once I was happy with that, the process is the same. I'm using my pastel pencils here to map in that base layer. Now the brands of pencils that I'm using are the Carbothello, Pitt, Derwent and Caran. I'm focusing again, look at how I'm moving in that fur direction. I'm always curving those pencil strokes, even though this base layer can be covered up completely if needed. Now the other reason why I like to follow the fur direction at this stage is I'm already training my brain to notice the way that the fur direction moves for that one animal that I'm drawing. If I scribble with my pencils to get a colour down in that area and I'm not focusing on those details within that reference photo, I find that sometimes that can then lead to a little bit more of a sloppier technique as we come to layer up those details. So this is just my personal preference, and of course pastels is very forgiving, so there are many ways to get to the same end, but this is my preferred way for working with pretty much any fur texture and fur colour. Now because I want my Patreon channel to focus on the pet portrait side of things as well as wildlife subjects, for any Patreon members who do maybe want to take on some commissions of their own, I've got a wide variety of dog breeds there, various colours, different fur textures, so that members can apply the tips and techniques that I've shared into their own work. Now as I've said, there are a lot of examples there, and I do have quite a few that focus on black fur. It's one of the fur types that I get asked more frequently about on social media, so I really did want to cover all aspects of that. Now when I worked on the other ear, this process is exactly the same. I really do want to be focusing on the movement of the fur. The one thing that can happen very easily, especially when drawing spaniel ears, is that the pencil strokes are kept too straight. They don't have enough of a curve. The other thing that's very important, this isn't just with drawing spaniel ears, it's applied to many other fur textures, is how to taper off your pencil strokes. So when you create your pencil strokes for each of the fur strands, you don't want there to be a harsh start and stop point. As I start to build up my highlights here, and you can see on the finished ear on the left, all of my pencil strokes have a thin beginning, a thin end, and they're slightly thicker in the middle. So the pencil technique is also going to help create this natural look. Now if you are drawing any animal with black fur and you feel like your portrait's a little bit flat, something's missing, it may be likely due to the values. So you'd want to hype up your contrast, make your darks darker and your highlights brighter, and you'll probably find that that's the cause. Now in some cases you might have a bright highlight and you feel that is bright enough. Let's say you've used white but you don't feel like it's as bright as it should be. The cause for that usually is that what's next to it isn't dark enough. As soon as you darken that section of fur, that highlight next to it will look brighter, and again that goes back just because you've refined more of your values. Now onto the nose, and I've got a few tutorials here on YouTube that focus on how to draw realistic dog noses. I'll pop one or two of those in the description below. But here, no matter what nose that I'm drawing, I follow the same process. I'll map in the nostrils, I'll make sure that they're the right size, the right shape, and that the placement is correct, and then I'll start to map in my lights and my darks around the nostrils. Now, if the nostrils are not right, it's very obvious, even if someone doesn't have access to the reference photo. So if the nostrils are not right, because the nose is in the centre of the face, it can be very, very distracting. So that's why I want to make sure that I start there. Now, with lighting on noses, because they are wet, they're going to be very reflective. So you can see that there are a lot of bright highlights around the nostril on the left-hand side that are not visible on the right-hand side. Now, all of this will follow that light source, and it goes back to the eyes and the reflections as well. You can see that on the left eye here, that reflection there, that highlight is white. I used that white pencil first. On the right eye, that highlight is not as bright, and I actually used a lighter grey first rather than a white. So the light source will always follow like a certain pattern. It's not going to be random, but again, there's no rules. So if you're drawing a bird in a tree, for instance, the light source may have many different highlights that are on different surfaces, and that's because the light potentially is bouncing and reflecting off of other branches in the tree that cause other reflections where you may not necessarily expect them. However, with a subject like this, where there is a one-sided light source, I want to be making sure that I've got that lighter highlight on one side and slightly darker on the right-hand side. Now again, with this nose, there was highlights on the top right-hand corner, so that could be bounced light again. I want to be studying that reference photo very closely. Now, one thing that's worthwhile doing in terms of your highlights and your shadows is always sit back in your chair, have a look at a little bit more of a distance and see, okay, is this reflection as bright as that reflection on the opposite side of the face? And if it's not, then that you need to have that variation. It's very tempting when we start adding in highlights to make all of the highlights as bright as each other, and then you're going to end up with a flat overall light source, which may not be the case. In some cases it will be, but for something like this, the right side of the face was darker. So here is another prime example. I've started off with a darker base layer, more greys, and I'm adding more of my lighter greys on top. So the way that we are applying the pastels is going to really vary. I'm using the same combination of pencils here, no new colours, but because I'm layering them in different orders, I'm getting different values, different colours and different variations. So here now, I'm pretty much done with the face and the dark fur on this portrait, so now I'm going to start working on the chest. Now when I draw white fur, this is just like with the black fur, it's going to be very subjective for the photo that I'm working on. So the base layer that I'm applying here is going to be different from dog to dog or photo to photo. If I've got a really white looking patch of fur, I will not use a darker layer like what I'm currently using here, and this now is a prime example. Here on this section of the neck, that area was lighter, whereas the sides of the fur were a little bit darker. So you can see that even at this stage, I haven't just put one solid colour down. I personally don't like to work in that way. I do feel like we have a tendency to rush through that portrait. So even at this stage, I'm judging where are my lights and my darks. Now the one thing about white fur is it's never truly white. Just like with black fur, it's very reflective. So I do want to be pulling in any colours from the surrounding area in that photograph if I can see it in my reference photo. Now the one thing that I want to mention here though, for me personally, is let's say this dog was out photographed on grass and there was a strong green reflection in the white fur. That can happen very easily, and most times that's going to be quite noticeable. If I'm not adding any grass to my portrait, I will usually take out that green tint or significantly reduce it, because I don't want that to make it look like I've drawn the fur wrong or that I've given it a very odd greenish tint. If you're including the grass, then yes, it makes sense to add that green into the white fur. But for this portrait, because it was head and shoulders, you would want to leave something like that out personally. That's what I feel looks best. But again, there's no rules, no right or wrong answers there. Now, just like when I worked on the black fur, I'm still judging on the pencil technique. So I'm focusing on my fur direction, fur thickness, and fur length. The fur length here is significantly longer than the fur on the face. I must make sure that I lengthen my pencil strokes to replicate that. And the way that the fur direction changes, especially on the lower part of this chest, is going to help form the shape of the shoulders. Now this is something that I talk about in all of my real-time tutorials on Patreon. If I don't get the curve right here, I'm not going to make it look like there's any legs that are going to be attached to the body, which obviously would be a bit of a problem. So I do want to be making sure that I'm following that fur direction right to the point where I'm going to start fading it out. I don't just want to start straightening my pencil strokes at the bottom of the portrait because that area of the body is not going to be in there. I still want to make it clear that that's where the legs would be joining onto the body if that's where I've decided to fade it out. And here I'm now just going to start adding the final details, the longer hairs that overlap the body. And the reason for that is they are sitting in front or on top of the chest, so I had to draw the chest fur first and then come in and add the final hair details on the ears. So I really do hope that this video has been useful. If it was, I would really appreciate it if you could give it a like and a thumbs up. And if you are interested in my real-time tutorials on Patreon, then all of that is linked in the description below. If you've got any art related questions, feel free to pop them in the comments because I'm more than happy to help if I can. And I also upload a couple of videos here to YouTube every week, so if you would like to get notified of that content, then don't forget to hit the subscribe and the bell button. I'm going to be uploading another video to YouTube next week, but as always, thank you so much for watching.